So, Brandon Birkmeyer, host of the Brands on Brands podcast and author of Front and Center Leadership. Thank you so much for joining me on Podcast Junkies.
Yeah, man, happy to be here. This is going to be fun. Let's do it.
This is one of those opportunities that I love about podcasting. I've been hosting the show since 2014, and I'm I always appreciate the fact that I can just use this stage to have the conversations with the people I want to talk to. And we got connected through hanging out several times at Podcast Movement, connected to our mutual friend Travis Chappell, and I was like, oh, we should probably have a conversation that lasts longer than like a night out or a night at the bar. And and as the night progresses, like the conversation gets a little hazier and hazier. So I was like, hey, let's, did your book at the last Podcast Movement in DC. So it's been nice to have that. I don't know if it's the same for you, because I get the sense, I'm halfway through the book, how much you've loved the opportunity to have the show, to just kind of have conversations with people who you're interested in talking to.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way. I mean, especially at those conferences, it's like we always end up at some late night, like International House of Pancakes or Denny's or late night diner. And it's, you never know where those conversations are going to go, but it's nice to actually sit down and talk with someone. And yeah, I remember the first conference I think I met you was the first one I'd been at for podcasting. And it was because our friend Travis had invited me. And it's funny, he invited everyone in our like mastermind group, which is, it was like 30 or more people in that group. And out of everyone there, he was like, hey, show up to the conference and I'll introduce you to the people I know in podcasting. And I was the only person who showed up from his mastermind group, which it was such an advantage to know someone who knows a lot of podcasters. So I showed up and he just walked me around and was like, here's Harry, here's John Lee Dumas, here's Jordan Harbinger. And just, like I got to know people in the industry very quickly. And it's exactly these kinds of experiences that I have been pushing into this book and telling stories with, because those little encounters, like trusting someone and just saying, okay, I'll go. And his willingness to do that for me and do something nice for someone. Like I sing Travis's praises all the time. And like, it's a huge reputation builder for him. And I will keep, like, it's been, I've known him 5-10 years now. It's like, I will keep talking about him. So that's personal branding right there.
Shout out to Travis. Yeah, it's so interesting to see his journey, because we connected when I was living in LA, and he had just been like kind of like he was just finishing up the door-to-door salesman stuff. So he was kind of pitching the podcast idea. It was funny because a couple of people in that mastermind were like, well, you should kind of like get into the door-to-door sales. You're really good at it. And he's like, no, I think this podcast thing would be really good. So I met him through John Corcoran. I think he was in one of his small like masterminds or something like that. And just to kind of see how he's took with it and ran with it, obviously, and has built up this huge visibility within the podcast space in this period of time has been so impressive to watch. But he's also just a testament to his character, like a really solid, down to earth guy, and love hanging, spending time with him and Jackie at the podcast conferences. And so it's just a lot of fun to get to know, and to know when you meet people, if you just were to see them from the outside, and to have the benefit of knowing them personally, and that they're the same person. So the kind of the vibe that you get on the show when you hear him, that I'm sure you and I can vouch for the fact that he's the same person when you meet him in real life.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say he's more personable in person, but yeah, he's a good guy. And I think that's how a lot of podcasters are. It's nice to see behind the scenes and get to know people in real life for sure.
So where were you on your podcasting journey when you were in this mastermind with Travis?
It was the beginning. Like I had left corporate in 2018, and the first thing that I started consulting, doing marketing consulting. And I was like, I have a resume that was really great, but no one knew me. I had no reputation amongst entrepreneurs. I had no online content or presence. So I immediately started doing blogs and videos and social and podcasts and just kind of bootstrap things together. And when I got to know Travis, I had already launched the show in the Brands on Brands podcast, and I had 30 episodes out, and it was just solo shows and, me just finding my voice and perspective. And then I found Travis's show because I was looking for podcasts, kind of like as my education tool. And I was looking up like how to be more, how to network better, how to build relationships, how to be, I discovered the art of charm podcasts. I discovered Travis's, which at the time was called Build Your Network. And I was like, these are great. And in Travis's episode, he said, hey, if you want to talk to me, like, here's my calendar. So I did that. I actually set up a call and got on the phone, and he was like, hey, you should join my mastermind. And I was like, I don't want to. I'm not looking for that. But he did say, hey, I also help people with podcasts. I do some coaching. I was like, I'm just getting started, but I love what you've done with your show. Like, yeah, let's do some coaching. And he gave me I'll throw in the mastermind for free. And that's how it started. But based on what I learned just through having mentorship and understanding more, I completely deleted the show and started over. Like, yeah, I said, okay, I'm going to go 3 days a week now. This is at the beginning. I'm going to add interviews with thought leaders and authors and speakers in marketing. I'm going to have a solo show also. And then I'm going to have like a behind the scenes show. And I'm going to launch with more episodes in my back pocket and do an actual launch party and promotion. And it completely changed the way I was treating the show and valuing the show. And it's, because I relaunched it the right way, I was like, oh, we're like straight to at the time, the new and noteworthy for 7 weeks and higher rankings and things like that. So it definitely helped to get some coaching and mentorship in the space.
If someone were to listen to those first round of episodes that you did compared to the relaunched and revamped episodes, what would be the difference?
I'd say the main difference was the format. The content I was still finding my voice, but adding in the interviews, I think was a big difference because I think John Lee Dumas says this. When I talked to him, he has this idea that when you and someone else come together, it's two people sharing ideas, like something brand new forms, like new ideas come up that would have never come up before. So the opportunity to really talk to leaders in my industry changed how I think about things and changed how I come up with opinions and how I form my perspective. So I think it influenced how I think and how I, come up with my own ideas. So just the format itself was the biggest difference. And yeah, I think just over time, I started to think differently about how I make a show and what kind of things I talk about instead of just how-tos and that were random. Over time, I started to say, okay, how do I make this more consistent? How do I make topics that are more in line with, one train of thought?
And so when you started doing the solo content, a lot of people that start podcasting, if they've already got like a subject matter that they're well versed in, like for you, for example, with brands and all the experience you had in corporate, did you find it easy to mine that for solo content? Because, you do have to fill up a bit of space, even if it's just doing like a 30-minute show, and you have to have content will engage people and keep them coming back. And so to your point, you have to have a lot of content to create. Whereas with an interview, it's the content sort of creates itself because that dynamic conversation, depending on the skill of the host and and how entertaining the guest is, you can usually fill up that hour pretty quickly. So what were you feeling was like a challenge for you, or as you were getting started, in terms of like generating all this solo content?
I'd say at first it was exciting because I had so many things that I hadn't shared over time. Like in corporate, you're really just checking boxes, you're giving recommendations, but you're not actually sharing unique perspective that is yours because, you want to be corporate safe, basically. So it was really exciting to actually share how do I feel about this and to sharpen that over time. So that was really exciting for me. I actually feel like it was very powerful for me, for my confidence, for how I kind of go into, building a business, building a brand. So for me, perspective is power. So that was what I was gaining from doing it solo. Yeah. And I pulled from my old experience, but what I found out was that it was actually what unlocked me being able to do this more consistently was really having a structure for pulling out my ideas and for brainstorming. And the structure part of it was really simple. It was the way we write term papers in college or high school. It's, what's the main premise? What are 3 supporting points and what's your conclusion? Once I made it simple and it became not such a rant and just, here's how I do it. And I'm like, oh, I could do just about anything, like anything that you are generally interested in. I'm like, if you were like, Brandon, tell me about parenting, because I got kids. It's like, okay, well, here are 3 things about parenting, what to feed them, how to keep them active, and how to give them some values. I'm like, you could do that for anything. Like pick 3 things and then tell some stories about how, how you do that and what your opinions are. And I'm like, man, once I realized it's that simple, just like you have conversations with people, I was like, I could really do this about anything. I like marketing. That's why I talk about marketing and branding. Like I enjoy it. It's like when you're like, what do you do for fun? I'm like, I'm reading marketing books. I'm like listening to marketing podcasts. Like I nerd out on that stuff. I have hobbies too, but this is how it's an expression. I'm like involved in marketing in a way that actually fulfills me. It's fun.
Well, because also then you have to apply it in real life because now that you're an entrepreneur and you're a business owner, like all those, theoretical things you learn about marketing, and most of you don't learn in school, you learn like on the job. And I've probably learned more about marketing since leaving corporate. Even though I was in corporate marketing, I was working more on like the business intelligence side. So I wasn't directly involved in like campaigns and stuff, but I was at E-Trade, right? And they did some of the craziest stuff, for the baby in the Super Bowl, and you could kind of see how they were just thinking outside the box with these ideas. And so I think a lot of it, some of that through osmosis, is just like, oh, I was like, oh, this is kind of the way they were thinking as an entrepreneur. I've always felt like my marketing brain kicked into overdrive, so now I can have conversations with other entrepreneurs, and I notice I'll get into like a marketing flow where it's like my marketing brain is lit up, and I'm like, oh, we could do this and try this and try this and try that. So with you, in terms of your corporate background, what was the thought process like when you went to get your job? I know we all have a vision of where we think our life is going to go when we get the 9 to 5, and like that's the holy grail. And like I remember the first time, like I put on a suit for work. I'm like, this is it. Like I made it now. And the first time, like you get your 6-figure salary and stuff like that. But I'm just curious for you personally, like without getting into the full resume, like what that corporate journey was like for you.
It was, I would say it was, I enjoyed it, but what's really true is that my value system, like I am someone who values certainty. Like I am looking for the safe route. I'm not an entrepreneur by nature. So, getting out of college, I studied marketing, finding a job that was in the advertising space at ad agencies right out of college was, it just made sense for my personality. And most people, like they change over those first 20 years of a corporate life, they change jobs and careers. There's multiple pivots, usually 3 to 5, I think typically. I had zero. Like I did this one career path for 17 plus years, and I liked the job, but it was also just I knew that this was a route that was safe and certain, and I enjoyed that. And you could see the progression. But I would say this, when I got to, those like senior level positions where you're a director, you're a VP, that kind of stuff, I started to, like, that certainty started to waver. I started to realize that my bosses that were 5 or 10 years ahead of me in the corporate structure, the people I looked up to, mentors of mine, they were starting to lose jobs. And it's because there's less and less positions at the top. So when you'd see, hey, they're out of work, it would be for a year at a time or more. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this isn't as certain as I thought it was. Like the fear of my future got, kind of overwhelmed the fear, like the need for certainty. I was like, this isn't certain. Like, what am I going to do? So I started to really rethink, how do I take back control of my progression, my opportunities, my way forward, and I started to do a lot of self kind of analysis and taking in content. And I was like, oh, this is where I realized like I have a resume, but I don't have a reputation, and I need to work on that and see what I can build on my own. That kind of started me down this road that we're on today. But yeah, I have a lot of great lessons that I want to take with me, right? Like tools I learned from marketing that if I didn't have those tools, I couldn't do anything that I do today. And I love to think about, what are my stories? What are my lessons? What did I learn from an advertising campaign or a method that I can apply to podcasting or to personal branding or to just reputation building in general?
Yeah, something you alluded to in the early part of the book was this idea of like a little bit of a wake up moment for you. And you talked about not having that reputation because when you leave, it's just a cliche in corporate world. Like you only look at your LinkedIn when you have to change jobs, or you have to, or you get let go and you have to all of a sudden like brush up your resume, go look what's on LinkedIn. And that was sort of happened for me because I got sort of like, I realized that my last job was with a consultant. I was doing some consulting, and they'd hired someone who's got like 20 more years experience in that industry. And I was like, okay, writing's on the wall. Like I need to like figure out something real quick. And then I just understood, and similar probably to what we talked about with Travis, I realized that networking is really important. I just kind of deep dove into LinkedIn and joining like high-end masterminds and associating myself with people who were smarter than me, knew more than me, or who knew this world of digital marketing. I remember that first time I joined an expensive mastermind, it was like 1,500 bucks a month. And I was like swimming in this like sea of like six-figure, seven-figure entrepreneurs that I just like that I had no clue even existed in, what's digital marketing. And always call it my digital Narnia. But I came across that Jim Rohn quote, "You are the average of the five people you spend the most time with." And I was like, whoa, it just, and it sounds like a similar journey that you were on, but this kind of like aha moment of this other world that existed.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And that journey was new for me. It was probably the hardest part was having never really done any networking or relationship building or getting used to using those muscles was definitely an experience. And I talk about that in the book. It's like I think there's three pieces to what I think like really rounds you out when you're developing your reputation. One of them is I think this thing we're doing right now, which is content creation, which I call like one of the levers you pull for is building authority in your market. The second is what we're talking about, networking. It's really how do you build community? How do you build influence? And then the third is about creating impact through value creation that creates credibility. So those three things are the biggest lessons I've pulled that I'm sharing back out right now. But yeah, to your point, like for example, with Apple, right? When we are they have ads everywhere. They have an amazing product. They have beautiful stores. What's interesting to me is that they are great at partnering, right? It's not just Apple that's talking about Apple. You have all these phone carriers that that they have to work with that you can buy an Apple phone in, and they have to partner with those people too. And you're going to see commercials that are like, "Hey, like this plan with the Apple phone." And so there's a collaboration there. And that nature, I think, raises all boats. But Apple itself has to establish its identity aside from that. Because you're like T-Mobile, not super classy, right? You walk into a T-Mobile store, it's kind of gross. But you walk into an Apple store, it's like a museum. It's beautiful. It's, the glass walls and like the geek squad people or whatever they're called, the Apple, whatever they are, the geniuses, that's what it was. The Apple geniuses are, not like customer service people. They feel like, like experts in their field. So there's something about this, kind of owning your own, like identity, but then figuring out ways to partner. And I think that's when I'm coming into like the podcasting space, I was like, oh, like I had a lucky encounter that turned into me realizing, oh, this is how I want to be. I want to find people like Harry that I can build friendships with. And then who knows, 4 years later, we're doing content together. And it's not forced. It was just because, hey, like this works out. Let's see if we can do a show together. And we didn't force it from the beginning because that's how relationships are.
What would you must come across colleagues, friends who are in the same position you were, in back in 2018, and I'm sure they're coming to you for guidance. And we have people that that listen that are still in the corporate world and are always afraid to make the jump. And so, I think you referenced it earlier. It's moving more and more to the point where you really feel that you don't have control of your own future when you're in corporate. And people just love that security blanket, and they feel like as long as I keep getting that paycheck, then I'm good. And they try not to rock the boat. But a lot of times, these changes, these acquisitions, they're letting people go all the time. They're cutbacks in staffing, like those are out of your control. So as I'm sure you've been having some types of these conversations with friends who are in sort of in that space, what guidance do you give them? Because I feel like this is happening a lot more to people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, what's like the hardest for me to see is the like open for work signs on LinkedIn for people that I know, but especially when it's the post comes out and they're like, I've been looking for a year. And you can feel the kind of like panic that's in their voice. And what's hard is when you're looking for a job, when you're out of work, it's the hardest time to find a job, right? And it's the most stressful. You're not your confident self. You don't have leverage. So it's almost too late to, apply what I think is the best practices. So at that point, it's just, what can I get that'll like get me grounded again? And that I think is just hustle and relationships and whatever else. But, there's that saying like dig the well before you need the water, right? So for me, it's when you have the job and the security, how do you wake yourself up to say, what can I do right now to invest in myself, to be employable, to be promotable, to be more desirable to, whatever that goal is from the beginning that I can work on right now. And I think of it as like there's a sea of sameness that happens, especially in a corporate environment, but it happens to all of us too, right? Sea of sameness amongst podcasts and whatever else. And what it is, it's based on fear and safety, right? You stand too far out, it's like you're going to be judged. You're going to like have a choice to, it's like if you're in a herd, like you're going to be the first one, like chased down by the wolves or whatever. But for me, you have to, in corporate, you're definitely encouraged not to stand out and to take a risk. It limits people from becoming leaders in organizations because you could just wait and see what happens and hope that your turn comes up. I think that mentality is the biggest problem. And when I looked at that deeper, when I said, if I look back at what really was happening to me, I think it was an unawareness of this type of reluctance that a lot of us have to put ourselves out there. And I actually realized it's three different things, if you don't mind me elaborating.
Yeah, please do.
For me, and this is just my point of view on it, I think there's three types of reluctance. If we can be more aware of, it's easier to kind of deprogram ourselves a little bit. The first is just classic reluctance. Like if you don't want to do something, you just don't want to do it. And you have good reasons. You're like, I don't want to eat at this restaurant because I don't like that kind of food. Or, I'm not in the mood right now. You have good reasons. So that's just classic reluctance. There's a good reason to do it. You don't feel like doing it. You decide not to do it. There's second type of reluctance I'm very much guilty of. And that I like to call the thoughtful indecision, where you are, overthinking all the different ways something can go, analysis paralysis, making a pros and cons list. You're dragging your feet because you want to have some certainty around your answer, right? That definitely can get in your way, where you are slow to make decisions and also slow to get to opportunities. So like seeing where you could, where does it actually matter? Like, are there certain situations where I should just make a decision and be faster? And then the third, I like to call agreeableness, right? This is like the consensus building. This is where you and four other people are in a group. Well, what do you want to do? I don't know. What do you want to do? Or what should we do? Let's take a vote. Let's see what happens. And these are all natural things that humans do because we don't want to rock the boat. But at the end of the day, if you're always agreeable, you may not ever get what you would have chosen in a situation, or your opinion may not be heard. And maybe that day you needed to fill your cup. Maybe that day it needed to go your way for you to be the one who had the opportunity to, whatever it might be, get promoted, be seen, whatever it is. So I think if we can recognize these three things, that classic reluctance or that agreeableness or that thoughtful indecision, we can, not all the time, but sometimes just say, what if today, let me just play it out in my head, I did something a little different. Like I went with my gut on something. I took a risk that was comfortable for me, and see what happens and see where that could take you.
How did this come to you? Because I know you touch on these three things in the book as well. And was this just sort of by experimenting yourself, by trial and error, or were there mentors that you worked with, or people you talked to on the podcast? I'm curious how, this awareness of, these types of behaviors came into your focus.
I think it was me looking backwards and saying, I'm doing it more often now because when I jumped into entrepreneurship, you kind of had to. Like it becomes, there's more, like every day you're putting yourself out there. Every day you're taking a risk. Before that, I wasn't doing it. It was very rare. I was playing it safe. But then I would look back and say, did I ever take initiative? And yeah, like there are some big opportunities and changes in my life that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Like I never would have worked on Coca-Cola had I not decided to chase my girlfriend across the country because, I just missed her, like the decision to completely uproot your life, to move to a different city when you have roots and a career and a job and connections. I think it happens to all of us. A lot of us have that choice sometimes where you're like, well, it's a fork in the road. And usually it's like a new career, a job, a big move across, to a different town, a new friendship, whatever it might be. And I think if we look back, a lot of us actually have been brave and taken some risks in our lives, and recognizing that you can do that and that you've seen some success in that, I think is very empowering to say, maybe I could do this again. And once you get a little momentum in that, now I'm excited. Like we moved across the country. 3 years ago from Los Angeles to Raleigh on the same kind of gut feeling that was like, you know what? Like our lives could really change if we moved to somewhere that was 80% less expensive for housing costs. Like what would that do to our lives? So I'd say it wasn't like an instant realization, but it was definitely over time. And then looking back and doing, I reflect more than I ever did before now that I'm getting older, but definitely it's increased since when I started.
Talk about the origin story for the book. Like, where did you get the idea and how did that process come about?
So I didn't want to write a book, Harry. If you really want to know, I thought that sounded like the worst waste of time because the typing and sitting there and they're like, just sit down for an hour a day and try to write 500 words. I was like, that's a lot of days of doing that. That sounds like homework. I don't like it. But so it wasn't on my priority list. I did want every year I take on a project, right? This is part of my mentality of self-development. I'm like, what is my next project? Starting the podcast was a project, building it to a YouTube channel, building online courses, and public speaking was on that list, right? This is what I want to do to continue to expand my reputation, to build out my skills, to connect with more people. I want to do public speaking. So I joined the National Speakers Association. I found some mentors. I looked at speakers who were doing it well and I was like, what did they do? How did they get there? And took there was a course through the National Speakers Association and that was fine. And then my mentor, he's here locally in Raleigh. He speaks all over the country. He said, hey, Brandon, if you really want my advice, he said, I'd write a book. And I was like, Stan, what other advice do you have? I was like, I don't need a book. I have a podcast. That's my brand, right? And a blog and a YouTube channel. He's like, well, no, there's something about a book that focuses your ideas to one central, like guiding principle. And a podcast is great. You create content every week, but you have kind of the room to meander and to kind of venture out. But, just like a keynote speech, a book really you have to get in there and say, what do I want this to be about? Who is this for? What problem does it solve? So he was right. And so I said, okay, I'm going to pause on, trying to pitch for speaking gigs. And I'm going to put my head to the grindstone and write this book, what I want it to be about. And I knew it was going to be personal branding. And then I was like, well, who can it help? And it surprised me, but I really wanted to help the me from corporate. So I geared it towards that. I think the lessons apply to entrepreneurs or anyone whose like reputation affects their business, really service-based entrepreneurs. But really it was written for, the me that was back in the day. If I had started again, what would I have done different? What skills would I have focused on growing to have maybe removed that ceiling and some of that risk when I was trying to move forward and grow?
And what was that process like? Was there guidance in terms of what to write, format, and because it's one of those things that people tackle, and a lot of people probably start and never finish. And so I'm wondering, how long the process took for folks that might be listening or watching and are interested in going down that route.
I love this question because the process was very intimidating for me. So if I can help someone else make this real simple, I always start with research. I was like, let me look at not research on my topic, research on what other people did to write books. And I found some speakers who had a book that was popular and a keynote that was tied to the book that was on YouTube. And I was like, oh, I can see how that core idea came to life in a keynote speech and in the book. And what they had done is they had a singular idea, and their singular idea had to do with the topic of how to be successful, right? And they said, okay, there's one secret to that, and then there's something to avoid. And so it was like the secret to success is discipline, and the thing to avoid is procrastination. And I was like, wow, I can come up with something simple like that. It doesn't have to be groundbreaking. And so when I started the book, I knew it was personal branding, but I was like, what stops people from personal branding, in my opinion? And for me, it was this idea of taking initiative. Like you have to take initiative if you want to be successful at putting yourself out there, at standing out. And for me, what's the opposite of that? What's holding people back from taking initiative? It's this reluctance. And that's why I came up with this. I was like, well, what is reluctance? How does it manifest itself? So that is the core of the start of the book. And then I already had my principles of what I think are the pieces of personal branding, this content, community, and impact piece where I lay out that framework. But if I just talked about that, the book wouldn't have a heart to it. So finding these kind of core concepts really started me on the way. And then it was just a matter of figuring out how to do it. Cause like I said, the writing stuff seemed terrible, but I was like, oh my God, I'm recording podcasts all the time. I'm very comfortable speaking into a microphone. So guess what? Many books, maybe more than half of books, I don't really know the number, but I know it's high, are actually dictated these days. People dictate their books and you hire these wonderful editors to help, turn it into something more readable versus listenable. So that's what I did. And I'll tell you, I'd sit down for 3-4 hours at a time after I had a well-written outline. And in 8 sessions, I had 60,000 words. So the book was basically there. So it doesn't have to be hard if you find a route that works with, kind of how you work.
And then you self-published it, right?
Yeah, that's a me thing. That everyone's different. If you're not interested in that, I would, hire it out. But I personally like to learn how to do things my way, and ways that other people have done it. But then how do I like to do it? Because I then want to teach it back to people. I want to teach how I wrote a book to people. I want to teach how I created courses to people, how I started a podcast to people. Because to me, it's all part of this personal branding puzzle. And I love coaching. I love mentoring. So everything that I take on a project as myself, I see as an opportunity to learn it in a way that I would teach to other people. And the way that I like to teach it is, how do I make this like just what's necessary? Just like the simplest way to do this, not like the most hard opus, like this is your opus or this is like the fanciest thing. So yeah, I self-published through KDP, and I watched a lot of videos on YouTube, and again, looked at other people's books, and I asked some friends like what they did and just went from there.
And so how is that now part of your process or your approach to getting more involved in like speaking and public speaking and looking for opportunities there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So part of the value of the book was I have a pitch that's connected to the book. And so when they see that, I think there's already an elevated, like this person knows what they're talking about. There's some credit given, some proof of concept. So it's obviously connected in that way. It's the title of the speeches. Are also called Front and Center. It also helped me focus on where do I want to pitch? Like, well, this is written for people in corporate. So my target for speaking was certain corporate offices, places like I'm starting in the marketing space and in the content creation space because they're places that I'm more comfortable. So it helped in that regard. But the other thing my coach helped me with is he said, the other reason to write a book is as a business, sometimes the budget for speaking is separate than they also have a book budget sometimes. So you could say, okay, here's my fee for speaking, but then on top of that, they might have another, 100 books that they could buy to give to their employees or something. And that comes out of a different pocket. So it increases your fees. It's also a great business card to hand out when I'm at conferences. I saw you at Podcast Movement. I was like, hey, like people I was running into, hey, here's a book. And so it itself is a bit of a business card. And I'm sure your listeners have heard that before. But I think there's that. And then I think there's the focus of message. It's like, what is Brandon known for? People start to be like, oh yeah, he has that book, Front and Center Leadership, that book that's about personal branding. So I think it also starts to become this thing that lives outside of you, where if you want to be known for something, you have some proof of concept that people can point to.
So if you think about the time or the moment that you decided you want to do the book to the moment where you had the printed book in your hands, like what was that range of time?
I would say that was probably just about 10 months from when I started. And really the book had been written within like very quickly, like within a month or two. And then I was doing self-editing for another month or two. Like that was like through the holiday season. So getting through that first pass of me rechecking it took a couple months. And then the editor was with it for a few weeks. And then there was some back and forth. And then it was like another 2 months of like cleaning it up, making sure it was exactly perfect, getting the cover designed and figuring out what my promotional plan was going to be, which for most people, like if you do it the right way, which I don't, it's not such a huge thing for me. You would have finished the book and still had you'd be promoting it for 6 months, right? Before it comes out. And for me, that wasn't the plan. That, maybe if I have a second book, I'll do it that way. But this, I just needed it out so that I could be pitching speaking gigs with this done, with the concepts clear. Because in my head, they weren't fully clear until it was finished. And then, yeah, so that's, I don't know if I answered your question, but that's basically what happened.
And would you recommend, looking back at the process, that somebody actually work with a coach?
I like, I think there's lots of ways to learn for certain kinds of questions, whether it's a mentor or a paid coach. I think it definitely speeds up the process. I think getting to where I have, well, I usually try to find either communities or people or both. So, like I said, with podcasting, I ran into Travis, but I was already starting to be like, okay, now I'm going to join the podcasting community, or I joined the speakers community, and then found a mentor through that. That wasn't a paid program, but actually there was a smaller paid program that was fine. And then for marketing my book, it was YouTube videos. So yeah, I think if you're doing it yourself, you're just always questioning, like, is this right? And for those, like I said, the people who are the thoughtful indecision people who are sit there dragging their feet on something, a great way to get past that is to just get someone else's opinion. So you're like, good, got a gut check, keep going, keep moving.
Yeah. And so we chatted a little bit about a podcast movement. I think you made a decision also to focus on a local market as opposed to just being a speaker who's just like constantly traveling, the road warrior, vision of speakers who get burned out eventually, because they're just spending 300 days a year just traveling and speaking at these conferences.
Yeah. And I think it's a business. Like, what's your business plan, right? And I think of like, everyone's like, oh, I have a coaching business, or I have an entrepreneurship business, a startup, or I have a course business or a podcast business with ads. And for me, it's just all a personal brand business, right? Like, I am the product. I have ways that I help people, and I like that to be diversified. I want there to be different ways in. So yeah, I've like created courses, and that is one line of income. I have coaching. That's one line. I like doing these things. I like making these things. And the speaking is just one more way in. I think for me, it's probably more of a lead generator, a relationship builder for coaching and for courses, as opposed to straight up being paid for speaking. But like, that is part of the income plan. So yeah, I wanted to focus locally because in my life stage, I have two young kids. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I want to be around. I like being around. So if that means it slows me down a little bit, that's okay. Like, I moved here purposefully so that I could make decisions that were good for my life, not just good for the business. So I gave myself a lot of runway, and now we can make decisions based on like what actually we want our life to look like. So yeah, local is great. Raleigh happens to be, they have a great airport, but also it's driving distance to, lots of major cities, Atlanta, Nashville, Orlando, New York, Philly, Charlotte, lots of places I could easily get to. And in that community, find, corporate headquarters, marketing associations, and conferences, places to speak. And that's great. If I can drive there and be back the next day, like, perfect.
So how's it might be just still early days, but how's that process going for like the outreach, submitting an application to speak? And thankfully I tend to do it in circles where I already have connections. So obviously, like podcast movement, I just spoke, but I have a relationship with the founders and I've spoken there like 3 times. So I tend to stay in my lane of podcasting conferences. But for you, like, for someone who's interested in, let's say they've got the book now and they've got an approach, without getting too much into the weeds, what's a sensible approach in terms of like outreach? You did touch on marketing, conferences, but what have you found so far that's been working?
Yeah. And I will say I am not the expert, right? But I've been studying experts and getting mentorship and asking. And I will tell you, besides the book, the second best piece of advice I received was that speakers speak, right? Like, the more you're out there, the more people will see you, the more you'll be referable, but you have to be speaking. And how do you get those speaking gigs? Well, you have to be out there pitching yourself. So that may sound obvious, but I'll be honest, I was there myself. I have friends that are there that like we fantasize about, like, oh, just people reaching out to us and giving us speaking gigs, right? The easy ones. The truth is, if you're not out there hitting the floor and reaching out and emailing people and applying to all these different places, you're not going to get the momentum needed to get started. Just like when I started the podcast, the second time where I like reached out to a bunch of people and I like set up a launch party, same thing. Like, for the speaking business, it needs a push, a momentum driver where you are actually physically reaching out and putting yourself out there for a lot of things, sometimes free things, sometimes not free things. So I reached out to the American Marketing Association, the National Speakers Association, the Society of Human Resource Management, Association for Talent Development. Groups like that have local chapters, right? They have a chapter that's in just Raleigh. Like there's a group of people here, but they are national and they're locally networked. So if I can get a job here in Raleigh, I can also, speak to their group in Charlotte and to their group in Atlanta. And that's going to get me in front of decision makers for paid opportunities. And I'm not making this up. This is things I'm learning from other people, and I'm just executing the plan. And I know that I'm bad at this. So what do I do when I'm bad at something? I learn what I need to do, and then I figure out how to get it done. I'm not the person to reach out. I found someone who was reaching out for other people, and I said, hey, I would love it if you work for me. So I paid someone to help me come up with the list of events, to compile it, to create a spreadsheet, to come up with contacts. We put that into my email management system, and we're shooting emails out and seeing who's opening them. And they're helping me do that. I just approve a couple of things and then like what the pitch looks like. But if I didn't have them doing it, I wouldn't do it. That's not the thing that like fires me up. So I'll avoid it. I'll find a podcast to record or a YouTube video to edit, instead of doing what I need to do.
Yeah, it's this idea of focusing on the things that you're a genius at, right? Only because I think the way it was described to me is like these four types of tasks. Those are incompetent at, those are competent at, those are excellent at, and then you're genius. Obviously, those first two you get off your plate as quick as possible. But the excellent is where like a lot of entrepreneurs get stuck because like web design, I could do a little bit of like web stuff and just dabble in there. And it wasn't until like years ago I got stuck like for 4 or 5 hours trying to fix something on my website. I was like, I called a web design friend and he fixed it in 5 minutes. And I was like, that's your genius. I get it. So, I think it's really figuring out like there are things we can do and probably could do okay. And we're excellent at it. But it's not that zone of genius. And I think the more and more we realize this as entrepreneurs, find as there's a good book about the who, not the how. Like when you need something done, like figure out who can do it for you, not how am I going to get this done.
Yeah. And I think what happens is too, the price sometimes scares us, right? Because a lot of that costs money. And I realize if I can pay the premium up front to get the momentum started, to get the things moving, then I can figure out how do I make this more efficient? How do I save money? So like when I started the podcast, I just paid an editing agency and it was fine, but I definitely was paying like 4-5 times what I'm paying now, because I just needed it done. I needed to not worry about it. And then when I was like, okay, I think I have a hang for this, maybe I can like find my own editor instead of an agency, build a relationship, vet who the people are. But I couldn't do that all at once. I could have done it in the beginning. It would have slowed everything down. So you pay a little bit more. So right now I'm paying someone more than I should, I'm sure, worth it for this stage, but more than I could be paying for outreach. But eventually I'll try to refine that system and make it better and make it more cost, effective for the time that's going into it.
Are you sharing any of this journey on the podcast?
I'm starting to. It's the podcast goes up and down. I don't always like to talk about the thing I'm right in the middle of. It's like, don't share your scabs, share your scars, like after you've kind of gone through it, what the lessons learned were. But I'll share, if I get a quick lesson that's tied to a story, something happening right now, I'll share that because I think that's fun. And the podcast, I'll say this, I've been pretty consistent with the podcast, but as these projects have taken on, I've been less consistent. I still, I'm putting podcasts out, but there's been breaks here or there because of like, it doesn't have to be like, oh my God, I've destroyed my podcast because I missed an episode, right? It's better if you don't, but it's okay. Like you give yourself a little bit of grace as long as you're committed to like, is this part of your world or not? And a podcast has always been part of my world, a part of like how I create and express myself. It'll always be there. But I've given myself a little bit of grace when trying to get this book out that like, it's not going to be as good as some of the other episodes until I'm back into, a normal rhythm. And I'm starting to get back into that now that the book is out, but it's like, that's okay. We're not always firing on all cylinders.
How have you grown or matured as a host since starting the show?
Have I grown? Or I don't know. What I would say, because I'm doing more interviews now, and I'm being interviewed now, and I think the way I interview has changed. The way I research people, the way when people come into my world has changed. Like, for example, like for this conversation, we didn't have like I was like, hey Harry, send me all your questions and let me analyze your questions. And is this right? And we just we get on, we talk about it. You led the conversation. We have it, it's had a nice flow, and you're listening, and it feels natural. But I can tell in some podcasts, it's like when I started too, it was like, here are my questions, right? And then here's a section where I shift to these kind of questions. That's fine too. People have that thing. But if it's so regimented, you lose it. So for me, what I'm really proud of is when I meet people, especially my guests now, most of them are an expert in something. I figure out what they're an expert in and what kind of questions I get really curious to ask to an expert like that. Like, even if it's not like, for example, a speaker whose their main topic is customer experience, right? I brought one of those on my show and I was like, hey, let's talk about customer experience for a little bit. But really what I want to know is, how did you speak 300 times across the country this year about customer experience? That's what I want to know, because that's the journey I'm on right now. And guess what? Like, I got all these great insights that wasn't their main expertise, but I talked about both. And I knew that they'd have a great time talking about it and would know what to share about those things because they've done it. And I think those kind of conversations where you're genuinely curious, you've done the work ahead of time, and you didn't ask your guest like to do the work for you. You know, I think that's the magic right there. Because again, like, I'm doing a lot more podcasts now. I'm getting sent forms to fill out, like answer all these questions, check their questions. I'm like, hey, it'd be great if I just show up and you guys like genuinely ask what you're curious about. you know?
Yeah, I think that that's been the journey that I've been on, because with this show, it's like 350 interviews, and my second show, Vertical Farming Podcast, I interview CEOs and founders, and that's 100, like in 40 plus. So, closing in on 500 interviews across both shows, and just learned over the years that it's really a matter of being genuinely curious about the people you bring on the show. So I always I want to be excited. Like when I see the invitation on my calendar, like, oh, we're going to have a conversation with Brandon. And like you said, I don't do a lot of preparation, but I'm just like paying attention to what you're saying, pulling threads. I always say there's the three people in the conversation: the host, the guest, and the listener, singular, one person listening at a time on their earbuds or in their headphones. And so as long as I feel like, I'm keeping the conversation going, helps me stay on my toes as well. And to your point, like, I'm following the threads. I'm asking questions about the book, process as well, because that's something that I'm interested in. I've done some public speaking as well. So again, just following your curiosity, and I think that pulls the listener along and keeps them engaged in the conversation, which I think is key.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. It's a fun part of the process. You get kind of proud of the work you do. You're like, I'm glad I'm getting better at this. It feels good.
Yeah, you put in the reps. So a couple of questions that I like to ask my guests as we get close to wrapping up. What is something you've changed your mind about recently?
Something I've changed my mind about recently. Oh man, God, that's a good question. I think most of the work I'm doing right now is with the book. And I think when I was putting the book out, I thought to myself, like, this is going to be like the focus. I have to build this whole other brand around the book and shift to, that being the focus. And I think what I've changed to realize is it is like, we are dynamic people. We get to kind of, because we're not just a business or like a product, like a razor or a tube of toothpaste, like, we can be dynamic. We can have lots of things going on. Like, you have a vertical farming podcast and a podcast for podcasters. They're completely different things. So it's okay. That's normal as a human. So I think that I realized with the book is that it can have its own life. Like, it helps me position myself in personal branding in the leadership space, in the corporate space. Great. My podcast doesn't have to be about personal branding for corporate leaders. It can still be where I want to take it. And like I can continue to explore my curiosity there, which was a nice realization that I didn't have to, like, be so consistent across everything I do along the way.
Yeah, I feel like that's more of a trend. It's like this idea of the generalist, and just dabbling in a bunch of different things and learning, like, like they say Leonardo da Vinci, like, he was a sculptor, he was a painter, he was a musician, he was an artist, like, he did all these things, and obviously he's known for a couple, but I think it broadens like your perspective on life if you can, like, you've dabbled in a bunch of different things. And I write a weekly newsletter on my personal site at harryduran.com, and it's really about sharing my journey, because as I get older, I'm like, I talk about DJing, I talk about spirituality, I talk about a vertical farming podcast, I talk about going to a podcast conference, I talk about my life in corporate. So And these are all the things that make us up as human beings. So I think we'd be doing a disservice to our audience if we just like narrowly focus and like, this is the only thing that I want to focus on. Because I think that model is somewhat dated because people would have the book and that's all they'd be known for, like that book. And like that's their one thing, their one shining moment in life.
And that's the common ground. Like when people like Harry, it's because of these other things. Like they could learn podcasting from anybody or the business of podcasting or whatever, but like they want to learn from you because when they meet you, you are a person, you have a personality, you have experiences, you have a history. And at something about those things are going to draw some people to you and push others away. And like, that's the beauty of it. And that's what makes enough room for there to be more than one person in something, right? Is that not, we're not all for everybody. So yeah, I agree. And I think in my marketing career, even though it was one career, like my whole life, I always avoided specialization. Like marketing changes a lot. I was always the generalist. I was in the strategy and planning, but there was lots of roads that were like, hey, digital advertising was just getting started. It was like, you can be the digital advertising specialist. And then it was the social advertising specialist. And then it was the Facebook ads specialist. And then it was, like the next thing and the next thing. And I was like, I want to know it all. Like I'm happy to learn it, but I still want to be the person that they ask and say, but which one? Like, how do I choose? And I'm like, yeah, that's called strategy. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, that's good. It's interesting. We were on the topic of branding. I worked with a coach a couple of years ago, and she's like, "What are you best in the world at?" And I was like, "Well, that's an interesting question." And I was just kind of like coming out of the spiritual closet, and I was like, "I want to work with people in the wellness space who are doing like interesting work in like spirituality, but still in podcasting." And I was pulling all these ideas together, and I came up with eventually with a tagline, which is now on my LinkedIn post of all places, but it says, I am the cosmic conduit for awakened souls ready to transmit their message to a global audience. And that's one of those, like you said, repels people just as fast as it attracts them statements. But I've had people like reach out to me specifically on LinkedIn. It's like, why did you connect with me? And they're like, and they show me a screenshot of like the header on LinkedIn. I was like, this caught my eye and I'm curious to learn more. So that just kind of speaks to what you were talking about.
Yeah, I love it. I love it.
Last question. What is the most misunderstood thing about you?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think for me, I when I'm out at conferences and I meet people, there, I mean, you get a couple of versions of me, but the version that gets, I'm a tall guy. I'm very noticeable. I wear a hat. I'm going to all the social functions, and so and I am an extrovert. Like that's not a misconception. That is me. But I'm also like, I was raised by a single mom, just me and her. And so I'm not like the most, what do they call it? Like I'm shy at first. Like I have to find ways to make myself comfortable for that extroversion to kind of fulfill itself. So it takes me a while and I'm better with a couple of people first. Like I like intimate conversations, one-on-one, one-on-two, one-on-three, to really, I think, get into the personality of people. And I think that people wouldn't expect that at first because I kind of seem like I'm bouncing around a lot. But what I enjoy most are those kind of one-on-one conversations and that like connection, which is why I love coaching, which is why I love teaching. And because it's a lot of it ends up being like you really getting to know people better one-on-one.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And it seems to be a common thread. People call themselves situational extroverts. And I find it too, because you'll go to podcast moving for like 2 or 3 days and then you come back home and I just want to get back in my cave and just like decompress. And I'm the type of person as well that's like, I'm the guy singing at the karaoke bar at the conference, but like when I'm back home, I'm just like, definitely like the opposite of that back home. It's just, I think you need that ability to just like chill. So. Well, I really appreciate the fact that we got to know each other. And again, shout out to Travis for introducing us. And there's something magical that happens when you spend a couple of days with a core group. Because what happens is like we have our crew now. So like whenever, if it's podcast movement, it's typically the same people. Like, I'll get the text from you like, hey, I'm here at the conference. Or I'll reach, Travis was there and my partner Natalie. And we just kind of tend to hang together. And I feel like you can go deeper. It's this idea of like, instead of going like shallow and just superficially with a bunch of people, it's just finding that core group, and just every time we get together now, we'll go deeper and deeper and deeper. And I think that's what makes just for more enriching relationships and friendships.
Yeah, I love it too. And for me, it's like, it's nice to not have to force it. So when I know that you're going to come to a lot of these events too, or someone else is, then I'm not trying to like squeeze everything about getting to know you into that like first conversation or second. Like I just get to be like, every time I get to meet you, I get to know a little something extra, like what the next thing in your life is, where you just moved, what's, happening in your business. And we get these little onions of that and of personality, these layers of the onion. And I think that's beautiful. And that's like how relationships should be. There's like way less pressure when you know that like, I'll probably see Harry again and again and again. And like, I just let that grow naturally. So yeah, I appreciate getting to know you, man, and all of our friends at the conferences. And look, this would never have happened had we not just like let it go. And it's been years, and like this is the first time we've done this kind of thing together. So that's awesome. That's awesome.
And it's just a reminder of like I always call the podcast your stage. Like you can literally like make it whatever you want it to be. And I think I talked about this at my talk as well. And just like, who do you want to have conversations with? Like create a podcast around that. And I think more and more people are coming aware of that. Obviously we talked about in the beginning of the conversation, people who are incorporated just don't know what to do. Just like, start that podcast, and believe me, it'll reap rewards. I said it at the talk, but podcasting has changed my life, definitely for the positive. So I wouldn't be where I am today without it. So I appreciate you like sharing a bit of your backstory, learning all the stuff that's going on, and having this long form conversation to learn more about you. So where's the best place to send folks if they want to dig into a little bit more?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And the book is Front and Center Leadership, which Harry has generously mentioned. And BrandonBirkmeyer.com is where all that information is about the book. And if you go to that books tab, there's a bonus section where if someone wants to get like a personality test to know, like, hey, let me answer these 10 questions and see where I am on my personal branding journey, you'll get a scorecard. And there's some other like freebie, like tutorial things there too that I won't mention, but there's plenty of bonuses and resources at BrandonBirkmeyer.com for everyone to check out.
Okay, we'll make sure all those links are in the show notes as well. Thanks for the time, Brandon. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.